Moving right along. At our last meeting, I looked into the audience, and there sat a gentleman who I felt was a Hawaiian treasure. And I was like, is that who I'm thinking it is? And it was. Kapuna Sam Ka'ai. And I asked him if he would present at our meeting, and he graciously agreed. I really, and he did our puli tonight. For me, it's truly speaking to having at our meeting a discussion about the new old way and our ability to value that and to have someone articulate it and just to bring that precious Hawaiian wisdom forward. So I gave him a half hour to speak. It's way too little time, but I want to bring him back each month. So let's. He said, well, let's get through this one first. So without further ado, please give it up for Kupuna Sam Ka'ai.
Kawa, kung may kay huli o may ay we did not come prepared to speak to a specific subject, but we just led off talking about coconuts. Coconuts, taro, uwala, breadfruit, are plants that have to have man. And man has been involved with it for over 10,000 years. They were the foods brought here by the seafarers. And bananas still have a plant that blooms and has seeds. But most bananas don't have seeds. Man has been interfering with that for that long. You cannot blame Monsanto. Now, Western culture gives credit to Mesopotamia, Tigris, Euphrates as being the seat of civilization. But go to the archaeologists that are working now. Southeast Asia domesticated the dog and all kinds of things given credit in their desert country. The green area where the monsoons produce this varied crop that man the word laka is supposed to be the goddess of hula. Only Hawaiians call it the goddess of hula. The rest of Polynesia call it rata, and he's a man, and he's a navigator. Like Maui, Maui is a navigator of an ancient form. Okay? So when they say, we Maui, well then you have to know that story to know what was accomplished. Same thing with the plants. They are plants natural in defense. Fortunate or unfortunate, I grew up, born in Hana, and grew up in Kaupo, a place called Mahua. Mahua is about 2 miles north of what is Haleku'aisun, or Kaupo store. And it has a certain rainfall. The major food there is uala, or forms of sweet potato. Of uhi, which is yam. It's not the yam you buy at the supermarket and call yam. That is not a yam, that is a sweet potato. And the leeward side of the islands tend to favor sweet potato, and the windward side favors... Oh, thank you. Tastes like fafa'u. Anybody know what fafa'u is? No. You take a freshwater shrimp, you put it in a small bottle, and about 3 days you start to pull on his nose. And when the body stays in there and the shells come out, it's fermented. Wow. Then you add that to coconut milk and water. What's the difference between water and milk?
That the milk goes to meat.
Yes. Milk is squeezed out of the body of the coconut. The water is patient. And drinking coconut water for your kidneys has to do with spoon meat. The ones that, the coconut that's developing sugar that you squeeze the milk out of is a whole different set of rules that go with that. Anyway, that fermentation is then used as a sauce for a lot of raw fish eating. Food, we'll talk about sweet, sour, bitter, and spicy. Yeah? There's a fifth category, and that is this fermented food. You see it in blue cheese and wine. In the Pacific, we see it as partly putrid fish. Many people eat that kind of half-decayed food. The idea doesn't appeal to you intellectually, but bread is about a half-decaying wheat made into a gluten and then baked. Okay, it's just where you're coming from, where your bias is. So Kaupo had a bias. He did not know there was a depression. The two shocking things that happened to the people in Kaupo was the Second World War and the 1948 strike. Anyone here familiar with that strike? Okay, you're all young people. For 180 days, there was nothing unloaded in Hawaii.
Wow.
Toilet paper disappeared in 20 days. Rice, about 90. Everything else quickly disappeared.
What year?
And the common sense of the conversation changed. We had just come out of the Second World War with the Victory Garden. And so people had pulled out their crotons, their lilies, chrysanthemums, all of those, and replaced that with every form of eggplant. I grew up eating eggplant, but didn't know that it actually was a fruit, perfectly white, looking like an egg. At that time, you learn things about what was necessary to cook. So everybody planted gandori beans, eggplant, barrels, every kind of container had green onions, garlic and ginger. Garlic because it's antibiotic, and so is ginger. Being the population was strongly oriental, those things were natural things you had, right? Like Greeks like garlic for the same reason. So all of this just happened naturally, except in the city. In the city, well, let's see when it started. It started when a submarine came off Kahului Harbor and fired at a water tank on the sandhills, which they thought was a fuel depot, and it turned out to be a water tank. And the bullets that went along that landed in Happy Valley and killed a couple of chickens. That was the reality. On that day, my grandmother came out of a country place and went to school and collected that which was hers. She just gathered up her grandchildren and went by the house and told the parents, "They're with me. You take care of this problem. They're with me." No discussion. Your parents own you, and you own your children. And if they defect, your fault. Orientals and Hawaiians think in that manner. There is no excuse for that failure of the child. So they are not petty. Now, the country area, I think there were about 24 hours over there, raising pigs without having your hotel give you all that extra green material, or living where there is a throwaway culture, is almost impossible, unless you're in Hawaii. You grow hundreds of pounds of peanuts to reverse the nitrogen in the soil, because you plant uala, and sweet potato takes it out. Also, what we call mala taro. There's no such thing as dry land taro. Taro will not live in a place less than 160 inches of rain. Dry land doesn't have that. It's wetland taro and is mala or lo'i. Wet paddock or dry paddock. Now you say, well, why have a place like Kenai where the fields are grown? That is Neolithic industry. 80% of all grasses cannot live underwater. You build a high bank, you flood it. You watch where that water go up, you slap all the trees down and knock over anything big. And then you drown the field. There's no sickle. Now, a lot of the things we take for granted, we call gardening, is really quite modern. So, the wet field and the dry field is the two things we took on. Mala means dry field, one you irrigate. Wet fields have that weed control of flooding the field. It allows, taro is a 12-month crop. If it's in a wet paddock, you can leave it there for 24 months. So it's a kind of icebox. And there are no iceboxes in Kaupo. So the kinds of foods that were produced, there was enough to feed the children. And the call was to arms for the unpleasantry of the Second World War. So all the men went off, so women ran these. It was not a great loss because the vaqueros, who were horsemen, tend to live 7 months of the year outside of the house. And when they came home, they couldn't really talk very well. They had become such a small, tight group of people that they grunted at each other and said one word that meant a paragraph. So they would be very quiet for about 30 days, listening to the women use language. You don't know that unless you live in the country, but that kind of thing. Hey, now, hold on. Some example. We picked up a woman in Waianae who was teaching a school, and she said, Kioni, aheli mai no hikali ku ai, kamea ai no kakahiaka, ahi-ahi, meaning evening or dawn, and get some food. And the nephew relates the message by saying, that whole thing was reduced to the right. So there is forms in language which are secretive to the peculiarities of your clan, your style. We call that the piki'ai. Pidgin is a form of language used for people who cannot pronounce R. Hawaiians did not speak Pidgin, they spoke English and Hawaiian. Now some of the crops when I grew up, I thought, oh, this is all Hawaiian. But they were called umjoy, pakjoy, manbak. Okay? And the round-head cabbage that we, kalua pig and cabbage, that was called pua pukaki, pork and purihi cabbage. The origin of the meal tend to be honored because it came from someplace else, and they gave it as a gift. They brought it so we could have it. You will hear them talk about Chinese buns, which we call dim sum, and we call mo'ono pua, better tasting pork. It's a cha su bao. All of these things are some of the cultural things that you kind of think is Hawaiian, is not. This kind of gardening that happened there is kerosene oil would be as expensive as you are worrying about a gallon of gas right now. Without that, there was no evening life at all. And so you would hear this prayer. It's like a chant. Boy, you're using up the light. You haven't done it yet. You're going to lose your eyes. Pay attention. That was farming, and farming has that kind of thing. People in the Midwest and other places in the world have that same rhythm. So all that cabbage, when you grew it, I don't know how many of you are growing cabbages in leaves, but you get these bugs come and eat your leaves. There's no spray, there are no plastic tents, there's no screening. So you plant a block of cabbage, and then an equal block you plant, I was just told last week, it's called chrysanthemums. We call it okole oi oi.
Marigold?
Marigolds. And the biggest ones with the awful smell, it's the one you plant. And this smell confuses the insect. And therefore the white butterfly doesn't form the caterpillars that eat the cabbage. The other thing that is happened is you grow tobacco. 200 yards from any garden you have. Tobacco has a very small seed. The wind will blow it and it'll take over. We thought it was punishment. You had to pick these leaves, and after you watered all the plants, you had to lay the leaves down on the pathway in every row. All the brown cockroach and gray beetle go underneath that, and when the dawn light hits them, the tobacco nicotine kills the bugs. Okay, that's the kind of rhythm that exists in a farm at that time. And do you know what garden tea is?
The tea plants?
Okay, any of you grew up with a house that had underpots underneath the bed?
Had a what?
Manure tea.
Yes, it's kind of a manure pit, see? You make it in clay and fish it up, and then you fill it up with water. You throw all your lobster, crab, shells into it. You grow certain crops that you put into it, and you put the thunderpot.
You put what?
Bedpans. That thing is awful. You let things rot. And again, we thought it was punishment. It's just on the head of the young person. But you stir it around, leaning way over. You scoop up a gallon can of it, put it in a watering pail. Then you fill that up at the tank of water, and you pour it on the cabbage. That's the fertilizing. Underneath rabbits would be a metal can, so you could collect all their urine and their pellets in another cage above it, and then that went into that pit. A whole bunch of things that had to be made. They were about cottages, and with the practice in Ireland. Anybody know what roof rabbit is?
No.
Roof rabbit.
Yes, it's the stuff you allow in your house. You call kitty. You take the head off, and you take the off a rabbit. You can't tell the difference in the meat or when you're cooking. So the French call it roof rabbit. Paris calls it roof rabbit. That's what they named it. All of these kind of things was necessary. We had geese and guinea hens, and I have bulls, peacock pecking on the head, because the animals were as important as the children. What you did not grow, you did not have. There is no wonderful market. Markets occur for villages, not for farms. So some of the things that happen. Now, the effect is that these men who went off, who were part of the farm, my grandmother had 14 children, they all went off and they came back with new habits. Some of you have them. Hopefully you don't. There was a lucky stripe green and a lucky stripe red. There was Chesterfields and Camels. There was Coca-Cola, Primo beer, red label, Four Roses. Those men could never go back and live in the country again, where everything was done for no money at all. The farmer had sway in that house. The stoop labor was the Lord. In the house in Kaupo, dinner was served exactly at 5 o'clock. It had nothing to do with the guests. It had nothing to do with the head household. It had to do with the cook. If you're making your food on a Chinese wok, the vegetables have to be eaten at a certain quality. Cannot be overcooked, cannot be boiled. It's not a boil-out. And so, to honor that which was cooking, you would show up at the proper time to admire the proper taste delivered at that given hour. Okay. This is the thing. Now, it was hard work. It was all labor. Now, you ate that early meal, and if you stayed in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, you were going to polish the pots. We didn't wash pots, we polished them. We didn't use Dutch cleanser like you have now. Certain kinds of lime trees were pruned during the summer. The twigs kept to cook in a wooden stove, and that was kept on the sink. So different kind of standards is set, and everybody had that knowledge. City people could get away from that, not the person living independently and in the country. The time for sweet potato was 7 months of the winter period. You can do this twice, but most likely once, and then you follow it with a new crop called peanuts. It puts the nitrogen back in the soil. Its roots were thrown and leaves were thrown in that same pit. And so there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds of peanuts. I don't care for them. Because every time you showed up, if you showed up, they put a ball. Would you like to have some boiled peanuts? They're roast peanuts. They're all kinds of things. Having to do, it also was pig feed. They were nice. They ate it with the shell on. No secondary labor. So that's the kind of thing that happened successfully here on Maui. Now, everybody had to do that for the military period, Victory Garden, because there was absolutely no vegetables. We never saw an ice box from Takatani Soda Works, now known as a 7-Up company. Ice was sold by the block. And this was a magical thing. We in the country, when we just hold it against our face, put it in your mouth. That was enough. Shave ice was magical. And if you know how to make tamarind shave ice, it would be one step into the first heaven. Now, that thing was put in a canvas bag, covered with sawdust, put on a military truck, drove all the way from Wailuku to Kaupo. And whenever it arrived, including 9 o'clock at night, the ice was taken out, put in the grinder with salt, and ice cream was made. So breakfast at about 3 in the morning was ice cream. It was that rare. Now the rarest thing, there was no ice box there, and during that strike, there was no citrus. There was, the health nurses were involved about that. Where we're going to get this? So Kaupo, we got 600 orange trees. So a person from here who owned the show said, I'll bring over some men, we'll pick it. And they did that. They brought 8 persons, a big flatbed truck. And after they had picked their fill, in fact, there was no room for the men to ride on the truck. They tried to negotiate with my grandmother, the pig. Oh, the Lord made the rain. I only prune its tree for my use. And my husband likes marmalade. You have the business of children. So, take all of it. And the guy was embarrassed. He said, look, I'm not going to sell them only in my store. I'm going to sell them to 4 or 5 stores. The problem is very large in the Wailuku area. So, by the way, up here in Kula, you didn't have that problem. Everybody was eating kumquat and loquat. You know, that vitamin C unit they're looking for. So, after they had come the second time, a strange brown frog showed up. And he took it apart. You know, he said, how do you get the ice? Well, when somebody brings food, they bring the ice, and it's gone. So what they did was they brought a kerosene oil refrigerator. And that happened in 1948. That's the first ice box in Kaupo. If you don't believe these things exist, you can go to Kaupo store. That's how you get your soda pop out. A kerosene oil refrigerator. Some of the country living here and styles. I also want to caution you about something. You seem to be vigorous with youth and a new idea. Everyone has come with its own new idea, including Masanto. And the pineapple company and the sugar company. They didn't ask us what they wanted to do. Engineers talk about injector wells and straitjacketing stream because it flooded. And everybody living on 500 square foot of a small house because that's all you needed because you had to go to the company store. These are tests proven not too satisfying in Hawaii, but it has gone through all these phases. You're going to try to make a run around the island. I suggest you go to those communities you're going to run to and ask them how they like it. You can be very enthusiastic. We had the bike ride to Hana. It produced 10 years of bitterness with the people who live along the Hana Road. Now I'm going to explain. You call it the Hana Road. But Hana, that road by Keanai in that area is called Pi'inau, the small intestines. The person living in Hana or Kipahulu that works in Kihei or Lahaina has to be on that road. He's a farmer. He works there for dollars and he rushes home to handle his crop. So when you feel in the road and says, you know, I with my t-shirt have sway on this road, don't you know that? He's going to ask you if you have 300 horses under your t-shirt and weigh 3,000 pounds. The argument is mute. If you don't want to get into all of that, please make friends first and talk about it. All this idea, when the Hawaiians walked around the island, you walk there at night. You tend to sleep during the day when the traffic is heavy. You walk in between them. That's compensating for that very, very narrow. Now I can say great things. I thought I'd never see it in my life. It is paved to Haliku'aisun, otherwise known as Kauposto. That we thought we'd never see it. That road was built in 1922 from Upalakua to Kaupo to operate OP-10, which was a coastal watch. I'm intimately familiar with that because 4 of the young men that came there, 2 of them married my aunts and took them to Chattanooga and to Oklahoma. And they didn't come home for 20 years or 30 years. In fact, one of them came home and said, "Aloha, you all. I'm sure glad you all come down and see us." Different people order different things and have different palates. Try to be more considerate of what you're bumping into. And some of these farmers have been cooler than grow the kumquat and all of that. You know, we could tell a house by looking at the trees in the yard. If you had figs, most likely you were Portuguese. For orange, lemons, and figs were the thing they did. If you were Chinese, then there would be kumquat and limes and lemons. Because lemons was a medicine, a cough medicine. You put it in a bottle and you keep turning it. And you fill it up with salt. The salt will disappear into a liquid. Then the liquid will absorb back into that lemon. And then you fill it with honey. And it's good for 20 years as a cough medicine. If you don't believe me, go down and ask for something for your throat in New Zealand. They'll give you all manner of things, basically lemon and honey. Yeah. We tend to trust the hocus pocus of a chemist company, and the common sense of our fathers we set aside for some new song and new hymn. Hawaii has had all kinds of missionaries. Maybe I'll leave you with this. The Hebraic persuasion came very strong for Hawaii, and the songs of Paul. Until the Buddhists came, we didn't know that. And the last group to come was the Jewish people. For Sunday, I went to church at a Catholic Mass ending at 7 in the morning. Spent the rest of the day in a Calvinist church called Kalavina, one called Kakalika, one called Kalavina. And it was about mischief enough to get a spanking every Sunday. But you didn't get spanking until you had the midday meal. You know what the Eflemo Eswego is?
No.
The African tulip, the orange flower. That's a weed. Now, it was brought in here to make life jackets. But in the First World War, jumping from a high ship, it will break your neck if you hit the water. So they went to K-pop. Those 2 trees are here, and that becoming a weed. But if you were a boy, you used the pods to build boats. And then you know the Monakapi, you know, put the little floor having water in it. Protestant girls, at least all my cousins, have to wear these white dresses with mutton leaves and big white bows. And of course, they sat in front and we sat in back. So just before they sat down, we squirt them. Well, I go to funerals now, and some of those cousins will remind us of why we got the licking, you see. But we would squirt them, and then nothing would happen till after you had been gotten a good meal and spanked heartily. So, country has its own lessons to teach. No one lives in Kaupo now. Bob Murakami goes there and takes care of the place. There are about 80 acres there. And, another thing about living in the country, if you cut the grass, the hogs cannot knead the grass out to get to the worms. So when you cut and make a lawn, they'll turn your lawn upside down in exactly 45 minutes, the whole lawn. You're now having Angus deer brought in for hunting. If you don't vigorously hunt that deer, it will overtake this island in 10 years, and everything you have growing will disappear. Husbandry goes more than I like this taste, and I don't think you're eating healthy, but all have to eat with a mindset from the same bowl, so each can give a hand, love lima. That is the most important thing, is the love lima. If the man didn't say hello, go up and kiss him. He'll be embarrassed enough to say hello. If he's not, teach him hello.